Okay. We've done the housekeeping stuff, so let me just go through some things in the time we have remaining. We're mainly focusing on Dickens and Reynolds today, asking a few questions about these first 2 weeks and the material of these first 2 weeks. Mainly, how are these Gothic stories? Um, at first glance, obviously, there's a ghost story element to them. But there's something a little bit more that actually doesn't appear in earlier Gothic romances that you see. I think Frankenstein is a classic example of like the first instance actually in which elements of the Gothic are superimposed with elements of the technological, where you get Frankenstein building his creature through the use of technology and the new galvanic discoveries that were going on in the late 18th and early 19th century. Basically, the idea is that our bodies are mere nerves, and those nerves course with electricity. The old Galvani experiments where you have the frog and it twitches when you send an electric current to it. Well, that was very intriguing in the late 18th and early 19th century imagination because it kind of led to a question of, well, what is life itself? Are we mere uh, are we mere machines running on electrical currents? And so Frankenstein is kind of an early Gothic iteration of that question. And especially in the Signal Man, you actually get some of those questions like the idea that this signal man is attached to this telegraph line. I'll get to why that's relevant. How do the Dickens and Reynolds relate to the zeitgeist in which they wrote, and how do they relate to each other, and any other questions? Okay. Um, there's a section here. I'm not necessarily going to read the whole section, but I just wanted to point this out at the beginning of Mysteries of London, where I think it's actually the pre-chapter and before the first chapter, where Reynolds asks these questions. Where is that city of fearful contrasts? He uses this term, fearful contrasts. And what are these fearful contrasts? When the technological revolution of the Industrial Revolution kind of took place and it led to more urbanization, there was this juxtaposition of grinding poverty and fabulous wealth that occurred that really hadn't. I mean, there's always been a disparity of wealth in all civilizations, I suppose. But it used to be that the country folk and the impoverished folk lived out in the country in the farms, and they were kind of out of sight, out of mind to a certain extent. But when you brought them all into the city, you had these fearful contrasts that you saw. But there's more than just those kinds of fearful contrasts, more than just socioeconomic fearful contrasts that are being described. So uh, let me actually, I'm going to skip some of the Industrial Revolution stuff because it's not that important. Okay. Um, so the Industrial Revolution, this is basic stuff just to ground us. It increased productivity. It led to cheaper goods, a population boom, and urbanization. It's kind of axiomatic. You think of the Victorian age, the 19th century in London, and you see scenes of poverty here in Gustave Doré's famous scenes of Victorian London streets, crowding. And that, again, back to the term fearful contrast, that was contrasted with this opulent, showy uh, decor, new constructions of these to showcase the new fabulous wealth of not just the Industrial Revolution, but in the case of England, the vast new wealth that was acquired through their empire. Okay, people came in from the farmlands, and so they were employed at cheap wages in the urban setting. So you have all these new people coming into the cities from outside and working in the factories. So you saw in one glance these fabulous contrasts between wealth and poverty. And so that's what Reynolds was focused on, and that's what Dickens also kind of alludes to frequently in his work. Okay. By the middle of the 19th century, the population of England exceeded the rural population for the first time in human history. I don't know. I'm going to just point out a few other works from the Victorian period. I don't know if you're familiar with James Thomson's long poem, The City of Dreadful Night. It depicted a gloomy, activity-exhausted London, traversed nocturnally by a sleepless narrator. And you get that in The Signalman. You see it in some instances in The Mysteries of London. It opens with someone walking through a similar street, Walter, who ends up being Eliza, walking through a sprawling, impoverished London street. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. So this excerpt from A Christmas Carol shows how if you were wealthy, you can afford light. Those who could afford it lived in airy, light, well-lit buildings, and a lot of those who could not afford it were consigned to darkness. Scrooge, although he was rich, he liked darkness because darkness was cheap. Why are these Gothic stories? I'm going to maybe digress just a little bit because I want to talk about something that I think personally is important and something I've actually done some research on in my own academic career. And if you'll pardon me, because I'm actually going to read a few sections of some writing I've done on this very topic. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to just merely read. Social commentators and medical professionals in the 19th century on both sides of the Atlantic were concerned about the new speeds, sensory saturations, and intensities of attention demanded by modern life. Many of the period's technological innovations, such as night trains, telegraph networks, and urban lighting projects, serve to facilitate activity in nocturnal hours and necessitate more regimented schedules. Sleeping in the face of these new environmental stimulations and social expectations of punctuality posed ever more of a challenge. In much of the literature of this period, therefore, insomnia came to betoken this Faustian technological trespass into the formerly peaceful night. Through the motif of insomnia, Victorians and early modernist poets and novelists drew attention to this disjunction between the weary mind and the unceasing activity of an increasingly technological urban environment, ultimately diagnosing a mind as alien to itself insofar as it was unable to rein in its own self-perpetuating thoughts. Before we move on, this section that I just read about people's kind of bodily needs for sleep in this case, kind of bumping up against the new expectations for round-the-clock activity and punctuality. What of what we've read, of the three things we've read, which of those three works does that best describe, in your opinion?
I'd say The Signalman.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Good. This is in particular reference to and kind of an allusion to the situation of the signalman. And we'll get more into the signalman in a little bit. Read all that.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
So this is just something I noticed is that they, in the Mysteries of London, they're having dinner at 11 p.m.
Yes.
Like that's when I was like, this is too late for me.
Right.
I already am in bed for a couple hours by then. Like that definitely
That's
plays
interesting
into the
that you should.
insomnia.
Yeah, that's interesting. You should note that. Why would that be something that rich people did and not poor people?
They can sleep in the next day.
Right. They don't have to be at work. Right. So they can afford, candelabras and gas lamps and arc lights and all these kind of lighting that was actually quite expensive for those who could afford it. Now we don't really think much about light, but in that time, there were new inventions illuminating the city streets and the interiors of Victorian houses, but it was really for the rich. And those who were poor, not only did they not have a lot of resources to light their rooms, they might be able to afford a candle or a little oil lamp or a lantern, maybe. But they had nothing to do past those hours other than uh, sleep, or maybe, if you'll pardon me, procreate. What could the poor do that was cheap or free? And plus, they had to be at work the next morning, so they were not want to stay up late. Whereas the rich is kind of, I think Reynolds. Again, not to make a huge deal of that, but I do like that you pointed that out, because it's a way that Reynolds hints at the fact that the rich are they can live beyond the restrictions that apply normally to the poor or people in general. And you mentioned that not only with like staying up late and having multiple wives or multiple mistresses. So those kinds of restrictions don't apply to the rich. And he also said, the law often doesn't apply to the rich, and it's misapplied unfairly to the poor, even when the poor don't really do anything wrong or are their poverty makes them more apt to get in trouble and more inclined to be put to prison because they don't have the resources to hire a good lawyer or anything like that. So yeah, all these ways in which it's interesting. There's probably a list that we don't have the leisure to go into now, but it's interesting all the ways that Reynolds depicts the poor as being under all these restrictions, and those same restrictions are escaped by the rich. So good. Um, Anything else? Any other questions? Okay, so let's move on. Sorry about the few minor technical difficulties that are inevitable sometimes, but I just want to talk about specifically Dickens. We know I'm going to breeze through the poverty aspect, which most of you already know about him. But one thing that maybe you don't know is that Dickens was in a railway disaster. He was in a big train crash in 1865, the famous Staplehurst railway disaster. It killed, I can't remember exactly how many people it killed. Probably look it up. It's probably like a dozen or two. Um, but Dickens actually helped people escape the wreckage. He was helping to pull people out of this wreckage. And it was shortly after this Staplehurst railway disaster that he became interested in rail disasters. And it was very shortly after that he wrote The Signal Man. Back to sleep, I've done a little research on this idea of sleep in this period and the literature about surrounding it. The signal man, he can't, or actually the narrator said that he wouldn't be able to sleep if he were the signal man looking at that red danger light. But there's a lot of literature that came out in the 1870s after multiple railway disasters, showing basically the effects of not even rail disasters, but mere rail travel. People thought at that time that the railway like vibrated your nerves and irritated them, and that you couldn't sleep, because there was always this sense of impending dread that at any moment your train might crash or something. Now, I just wanted to before we get into the Signal Man, I wanted to point out something called a modernist inversion. Scholars have talked about this, and basically what I want to imagine this concept as is a sense in which, like, we think how technology gives us power. It empowers human beings to do all kinds of things. And it does, we can pick up our phones and call our friends who live on the other side of the world, and it's very empowering. But at the same time, the inversion is it's not so much, or it isn't always merely a tool in our hand, this technology, but sometimes it slips our control and it suddenly kind of gets the upper hand on us, and it routinizes our lives in ways that weren't necessarily the case before. And I think in the case of the Signal Man, this is evident because when you have a railway that runs 24/7, in the middle of the 19th century, you for the first time had night trains. So the train in a Signal Man is a night train, or it's obviously it can run during the day too, but for the first time you have night trains going. And when you have night trains, then at any hour there needs to be someone awake to signal that a train is coming, or that a train has jumped the track, or that the switches uh, kind of switched so that two trains don't collide. Basically, it takes a brain and a hand to manage the whole thing, and that brain and hand can't ever fall asleep. So you have people staying up all night. And the Signal Man is a case in point of a person, and I think I described this in some of your discussion questions that I responded to, that you have this sense in which the reason this man has been driven crazy is this kind of overwhelming responsibility that he feels for public safety. And it's like he wants to do, and I've said this in many people's responses, but he wants to do this job so well that it's this overwhelming burden, and he's monomaniacally focused on doing this task so much to the degree that it drives him insane. Um, and the task he's confronted with becomes kind of a superhuman task that no person should be given such a weighty responsibility, where hundreds of people's lives are on the line. If he should doze off, he's down there in the trench all alone, in the middle of the night. And if he does the very human thing of like nodding off to sleep, then hundreds of people die, and it'll be all his fault. And I think Dickens is saying, like, there's something wrong with this picture. And
I think he's also pointing out that
yeah.
he even loses sight of his own mortality, essentially, because he's so worried about everybody else that he doesn't even imagine that it's him that the signal is for. He's worried that there's going to be another accident where the train's going to derail or whatever. So he's not even really looking out for himself. He's looking out for everybody else.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it's an interesting contrast, whereas, you got the Signal Man and Scrooge, who are both kind of these loners. But whereas at first the one, Scrooge, is kind of anti-human, and that drives him crazy. The Signal Man is like pro-human. He's like he cares so much about doing his job, doing it right, keeping everyone safe, that the irony is that it undermines his job, and he's so pro-human that he ends up killing himself and potentially others. It's a difficult. There's obviously some ambiguity in the story. Like, some people have suggested, well, maybe the Signal Man himself is a ghost seen by the narrator, and that could be the case. And which of the accidents are really this guy's fault? It's an interesting tale with a lot of different interpretations. Let me move on. So here's some. Let's see. I'm getting the warning again? I think if it ends, I'll just restart, and we'll just finish it up. But let's see. Okay, one interesting thing that I think is quite fascinating is the degree to which, and I mentioned this before with regard to Frankenstein, but the degree to which people in the 19th century really did see human beings as like little telegraph stations, like our nerves. This is from 1862. Nerves pass from the brain and the spinal marrow to every part of the body. They may even be compared to the wires of an electric telegraph. Did you ever see such wires? By the electricity which passes along them, the motion of a handle at one end will instantly ring a little bell 100 miles off. So that's kind of maybe a description of a motor nerve. You can send a signal to your hand, and it can move the hand. But it's also a description of the telegraph. You can send a signal to, the next town, and it will ring a little warning bell or send a telegraph message. And then the signaling station, is like the brain that enacts its will by deploying electrical pulses through the nerves. And then the nerves, through sensory nerves, they send messages back to the brain from our senses. So this was a very common metaphor for basically how a telegraph worked. Because when the advent of the telegraph came about, they're like, oh, it's kind of like your brain and the sensory nerves, motor nerves, but it's also a metaphor for how the metaphor worked both ways. It's basically what I'm saying. You're in control of your body through the nerves and the signaling station brain, but what happens when that telegraph system in the real world starts to operate 24 hours a day, as is the case in the Signal Man? Then this kind of adds extra danger and an extra requirement to stay awake and alert throughout the night. And I think the story is, in the period, is that it was causing insomnia, because everyone always felt like at any moment a new message could come in that they would miss. This gets into a whole discourse on the body and mind. So in Cartesian terms, the mind used to be seen as like this supernatural, spiritual function, and it wasn't tied to anything material. But in the 19th century, when you started finding that, hey, our brains are just telegraph stations, and our nerves are just, they're coursing with the same electricity that you see in the telegraphs and in lightning, and people started saying, well, hey, maybe our thoughts are just material. Maybe the brain or the mind is actually just there's always a material substrate or a material rationale or a material explanation for our minds. What we thought of was kind of supernatural or spiritual before the 19th century. That's why I thought it was kind of interesting that Scrooge would say, there's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. And what Scrooge meant by that, when he was looking at Marley's ghost, was you're not a spirit. You're not at first when he disbelieves that Marley's ghost was real, he was thinking, oh, I just have indigestion. You're not a spiritual being. There's a physical explanation for you. So, yeah. This is jumping around a little bit, but when they're in the mid 19th century, 1866, in this case, when the telegraph cable was actually connected from London to New York, it was the first time there was like a transcontinental telecommunications system. And suddenly, rather than people in London, rather than in prior years, they could just go to sleep after business hours. Now, hey, why should I be sleeping? New York is still having their business day. I might be missing an important cable about my investments from New York, so I better stay awake. So anyway, this is just, it's kind of an aside, but it's another sense in which people felt like they were becoming programmed by technology rather than technology being a tool in their hand. So in Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein thinks, oh, I'm going to create this creature through technology, and suddenly the creature gets the upper hand. And so you get this a lot in Gothic fiction, and I think in more modernist Gothic fiction that you find in the 19th century of like this thing that is technological that I thought was this familiar tool to help me has taken over my life and is now taking over me and is now my nemesis. So I think these are common threads that you get in Frankenstein and in these texts that we're looking at today. Okay, and
Which is
here's
still
go
a
ahead.
common thing. It's still a common thing for us today. I mean, how many horror movies now just came out with AI being the main antagonist?
Mm-hmm.
We've always been afraid
Absolutely.
of technology.
Yeah. And I mean, I've kept my eye because I've been studying it, but I've kept my eye in the last 10 years on people who complain that, you know, they're texting in the middle of the night or they keep their phones by them. They can't keep their phones by their beds because uh, they can't sleep because they keep getting alerts and they keep expecting someone to reply from India or somewhere that they've texted in which it's still broad daylight, but for us it's like 2 a.m. and we're still getting a conversation. Yeah, technology tends to do that to us. But you're right, AI and just urbanization in general, people talk about like, oh, wish we could get back to nature and stuff like this. So it's a common complaint, and very few of us would be willing to completely forego technology. We don't want to be Luddites, but we do recognize, even those of us who use technology, and we're using it now, we can see some of the downsides. Anyway, I'm going to actually end it there because we have 2 minutes left. I talked about most of the things I wanted to talk about.
Can you send us the PowerPoint too as well when you send the recording?
Yeah, so anyway, for those of you who, well, obviously you're all here, but even those of you who are here, you can access the recording. I'll send a link around if there were things you missed or if you came in, if you added late. But yeah, so I'll send a link around and yeah, I'll post the PowerPoint as well. And there was a few slides that we didn't get to. The ones I didn't get to were mostly just text, and I was just going to read, so you guys can read those on your own. So you haven't really missed a whole lot. I got 1 minute and 50 seconds. Any other questions, concerns, observations about what just happened and what has been happening the last 2 weeks?
It's slightly off topic, but when we're doing the research papers, do you want MLA or APA format?
You know what? I actually don't care about that too much. I'm not, yeah, I mean, for the purposes of this class, I don't know, maybe my bosses would frown on me saying this, but unless it's being published, I don't think that's something that I mean, I want it to look good and I want it to make sense, but in terms of which format you use, it doesn't matter to me, whichever you're comfortable with and familiar with.
Okay, thank you.
Professor, another question in terms of the research. I know we're still all figuring out, or I am trying to figure out what specific topic to write about. But in terms of lengthwise, can you give us an idea about the lengthwise of the paper?
12, I usually get about a 10 to 12 page paper. If it's 8, I'll start thinking, oh, this person could have done more. But if it's, oh, it looks like we got less than a minute. If you have any other pressing questions, I'll respond via email. But basically about 12 pages, 15 max, but you know, around there, I think. Any other questions? If you have any other questions, just go ahead and email me and I'll get back to you. But I think this chat's probably going to shut down in a minute, and hopefully we won't have this problem next time.